Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another IP Day Webinar Wednesday. I'm June Rawl, the director for IP Day, and I'm so glad you're able to be with us today. Today, we're going to explore how to best use the individualized instructional student plans in a virtual setting. The title for our webinar today is Using the IISPs in a Virtual Setting. I want you to know that we've been listening to you, teachers, administrators, staff, program coordinators, and we really have heard your challenges and your concerns in this area of a virtual setting. So today, I think you're really going to enjoy today's webinar, as Maria Gutierrez, no stranger to any of us, is going to walk us through these multiple ways that we're going to be able to really address your inquiries and your requests. She's going to refer to a few things and refer to them as 5 basic applications. All of these things are really geared to accelerating student performance and success. So let's go over a few little housekeeping reminders before we get started. If you have a question, do put it into the Q&A option and make sure you hit the send button. We're going to address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. So all throughout the whole presentation, make sure you put your questions in there. Maria and I will address them all at the end. Your microphones are muted. You are in listen-only mode. And today's presentation, like all IP Days presentations, are recorded and available within 48 hours on the IP Day website. I'm really confident that today you're going to find yourself coming back to this webinar time and time again. It contains so many rich resources and so much material that you can use to really look at increasing your enrollment, retention, and performance outcomes. So I know Maria's got a lot for us today, and I'm going to thank Maria so much for facilitating our webinar and turn it over to her. Maria?
Thank you, June. It's great to be here. Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today's training is centered around the individualized instructional student plans, like you guys know. We call them the IISPs. And the content that I'll be sharing is applicable to all subject area IISPs, the reading, the language, and the math one. Now, since we are limited to 1 hour, I have selected the reading IISPs as the sample that will be addressed throughout the training. However, please keep in mind that whatever I present today for the reading is exactly what will be applicable to the language and the math IISPs. What I will be emphasizing are multiple applications of these IISPs in your virtual classrooms. But before we begin, it's important to note that during this webinar, I will make frequent references to content that was addressed in 3 prior webinars. The first was the Individualized Instructional Student Plans, or IISPs, for the TABE 11-12 language test. The second was the Individualized Instructional Student Plans for the TABE 11-12 reading test. And the third one was the Individualized Instructional Student Plans for the TABE 11-12 language test. If you have not yet viewed these 3 training webinars, it is strongly recommended that you do so in the near future so that you really get the most out of today's training, okay? It'll clarify a lot of the information in here. All right, folks, so let us get started. Let me begin by setting the stage for virtual program success. We will need to cover 5 basic applications, all of them centered around the individualized instructional student plans that address common scenarios, which we have all encountered in our virtual classrooms. Our scenarios were pretty much initiated, I think, sometime around March of this COVID, year 2020. First, we faced the challenge of going virtual, and boy, was it a challenge, right? We labored and toiled, and we finally got our virtual classes up and running. Now we just had to learn how to be effective online teachers, which was another curveball. Now, many of you may already be back to delivering the brick and mortar instruction. However, the fact remains that with this ever-changing post-COVID reality, right, we must be prepared to move our instruction to a virtual setting at the drop of a hat. Today, I will address 5 very common scenarios based on inquiries and requests that we have received from many of you. The very first scenario addresses how we place students in the appropriate ABE level course and assign the appropriate level IISP in the absence of standardized pretesting. So we will actually take a look at 2 examples for this particular scenario. Scenario number 2 addresses the content we need to teach in order to ensure that our students will continue to make functional level gains as soon as testing reconvenes. I will share 3 new common planning tools that you will be able to use across your single or multi-level reading, language, and math ABE classes to develop your own scope and sequence of instruction that will target TABE 11-12 tested content. Scenario number 3 addresses how to use these IISPs to record student progress and mastery of tested content throughout the virtual trimester. Scenario number 4 is a challenging one. Basically, ask yourself, how do you conduct data chats with your students in a virtual setting? It's not as difficult as you might think. So I will guide you through this one very simple step-by-step foolproof process that you will be able to implement easily. Scenario number 5, which is our final scenario. I want you to think about this question that I know you have all asked. What criteria do I use to gauge student readiness for a promotion to the next functional level when there is no post-testing available? I'm going to show you how you can use the IISPs in the absence of post-testing to do just that. Promote your students to the next functional level when they're ready. Let us begin with scenario number 1. All right, let's imagine. It is the first day of your virtual ABE reading class. And remember, we're going to default to reading just for time's sake. Many of the faces you're looking at are familiar, but you look more closely at your screen and see some new faces emerging. You get all excited. As you start class, you notice that some of your new students are kind of lost and they aren't grasping the content that you are presenting. Other new students look bored and frustrated. You really want to assign your students their IISPs for your class, but you're beginning to wonder, wait a minute, I'm probably going to have my returning students stay on their current IISPs, but what am I going to do with these new students? I'm not sure which IISP to give them. I have no testing data for them, so I'm not even sure what ABE reading level they should be in. So this no testing situation is really becoming a challenge. I know you've all experienced this, but guess what, folks? Don't worry. We got you. We're going to look at 2 examples to address this particular scenario. Begin by asking yourself the question, does the publisher offer a pretest or placement test? If the answer is yes, then you can easily use the results of the pretest to determine the correct IISP level. In the example that you see here, the student scored a level M on the TABE 11-12 reading pretest, and this is the pretest provided by the publisher for the text that you're using. Now, which IISP should you assign to the student? Easy, the reading level M IISP. Now, what happens if the publisher does not offer a pretest, like you see here in example 2? Well, your district probably recommends placing the incoming student at the lowest functional level. If this is the case, assign the lowest level IISP. And as you provide instruction and the student begins to demonstrate mastery, be sure to jot it down on his IISP. Then, once the student has mastered all of the identified tested content on the IISP, provide him with the next level up. In this example, the student is placed in ABE Reading 1. As soon as he masters all tested content on his IISP Reading E, then he's moved to ABE Reading Level 2 and is provided with the new corresponding IISP for Level 2, a Reading Level M IISP. Now, I just want to emphasize that what I am sharing with you in this training, these are best practices that have been implemented in some districts throughout the state with a great deal of success. However, please always keep in mind that you must always follow the procedures and protocols set forth by your particular district. All right, let's move to our second scenario. So I now know which IISP to assign to which student. Next on my list of items to conquer is, well, what should I be emphasizing during instruction? My class happens to be multi-level, so what do I target so that when my students return to testing, they are successful in making measurable gains? How do I plan out the entire trimester for virtual instruction when I don't even have pretest data available on all my students? Tricky scenario, right? Well, again, we got you. Let's look at the formula for success on the right side of this slide. First of all, we begin with our new common planning tool. Folks, you're going to love this. It's going to make your lives so easy. It really is. You will have access to this new tool on the IISP website. Actually, they're already posted, so you already have access. But I will walk you through it anyways on the next slide. Now, you add to this equation, you add your students' IISPs to the equation, and then you continue adding your district's instructional calendar for the trimester. And you put all of this information together to develop a scope and sequence of instruction that targets tested content that your specific students have not yet mastered. Are you confused yet? Don't worry, don't worry. We are going to take it one step at a time. I know it looks complicated, but it really is not. Let's address the first component of our success formula, the new common planning tool for the multi-level ABE class. Well, first of all, there are 3 common planning tools for 3 multi-level ABE class. One is for reading, one is for the language, and the last one is for the math. Now, if you look at this snip of the reading tool, you can see that it is an at-a-glance of all tested content for reading for all 4 TABE test levels. Now, what we did was we took all of the information from all of the 4 reading IISPs and laid it out side by side in order to create one easy tool that you could use to plan for your multi-level class. At this time, I really just want to take a brief moment to explain each section of the multi-level classroom planning tool. Keep in mind that if you want extended explanations regarding this tool, be sure to read the companion resource handbook that's titled the same as this webinar, titled Using the IISPs in a Virtual Setting. And as with all the other resource handbooks and materials, this one can also be downloaded from the IISP website. All right, let's get started. Let's look at number 1. This is the title of the common planning tool for the multi-level classroom. Remember, there are 3 tools, 1 for each TABE subject area test. Number 2 identifies each of the 4 TABE test levels for the reading test in this case. Number 3 identifies each tested domain. In this example, the domain listed is a quote, key ideas and details, right? So you may begin to notice that the information on this tool is the same as the information found on the individualized instructional student plans or on the IISPs. And if you're making the connection, you are absolutely right. Again, remember what we did was align the information for all 4 test levels so that you could have them at a glance in one shot, right? Number 4 tells you the percentage of the test that is dedicated to the identified domain for each of the test levels. It's followed by the number of questions for each test level and the CCRS category. Remember, RI, for example, refers to reading informational text, and RL refers to reading literary text. Remember that? All right, let's continue. Number 5 gives you the tape category under the domain. For example, this is the tape section on main idea under the key ideas and details CCRS domain. Number 6 indicates the level of importance for this tape category as outlined on the tape blueprints. And then finally, number 7 gives you all of the tape skills that are tested under this specific category for each of the 4 tape test levels and puts them all side by side. All right, now that you understand how to read the tool, let's see how you can actually put it to use. To do that, you will need to pull out your students' IISPs for the next part. The next component of our success formula is your students' IISPs. Now, remember, if you did not participate in the webinar trainings for the reading, language, and math IISPs, I again urge you to please log into the IPDAY website and access these recorded trainings. I promise you, it will clarify a lot of questions you may already be formulating about today's training. Now, regarding these IISPs, you're going to have 2 possible situations. The first situation has to do with students who are returning students and who already have an IISP, even if it's an old one. You should only be concerned with content that is still identified as non-mastered on their IISPs. The second situation has to do with new students. Now, obviously, since we're dealing with a hypothetical situation where no new students have been able to pretest, I think it is safe to say that all new students have blank IISPs. In other words, no mastered content should be identified on these IISPs. Now, let's go back for a minute to something that we addressed a little bit earlier in this training. The fact that we said we were going to pretest new students with the publisher's pretest when this was available. Now, if you do, in fact, do so, be sure to transfer those results onto the new student's IISPs. For example, if the publisher's pretest indicates that the student has mastered the tape skill, identify the central idea of a literary text, then you need to be sure to mark this skill as mastered on the student's IISP. This will eliminate you spending time teaching content that has already been mastered by your student. So, once you put all of this information together from all of the IISPs, be sure to go back to the Common Planning tool and then with a highlighter, highlight only those tape skills which have not yet been mastered by students in your class. This way, when you plan for instruction, you know just provide like a brief review of mastered content and then concentrate the effort of your instruction on non-mastered content. Now, just remember, we're still working with scenario number 2, right? However, now it's time to address the third component in our success formula. This third component addresses setting up an instructional calendar for your virtual trimester. All right, let's get started. We're going to take it step by step. The easiest way to do this is to use a spreadsheet, Excel, for example. Just take the spreadsheet and create your calendar in rows rather than tables, as shown on this slide. Be sure to include, by the way, only the instructional days. Exclude holidays, weekends, and planning days because you are not going to be teaching on those days and it just clutters it up. All right, so now you're ready to put together the final result. Let's move to the next slide. The final result of our success formula has to do with finalizing a scope and sequence for your ABE class that targets tested content that hasn't been mastered by the students in your specific class. Not in general, this is tailored to your class. So what you need to do is plug in the tape categories and tape skills that you want to address during each day of instruction. Now, these, by the way, should be the ones which you just highlighted on the Common Planning tool because your students hadn't mastered them. So remember, because you're working with a spreadsheet, you can easily move these boxes around to make sure that you cover all tested content within the date parameters for the trimester. Finally, be sure to place the tape level in parentheses after each tape skill for easy reference. Now, this is critical information if you're going to group your students accordingly, okay? Then go back, double check just to make sure that your scheduled instruction includes all non-mastered tested content represented exclusively by the students in your class. And remember also that you can refer to the companion resource handbook for a much more detailed explanation of this particular process. Now, before I move on, I do want to make one final note here. Setting up your class this way will take a little bit of time initially. However, I promise you, it will ensure that you maximize your virtual instructional time in order to provide your students with the greatest opportunity of making measurable skills gains. As you plan your virtual lessons throughout the trimester, you must be sure to cover all the content that is identified on the FDOE curriculum frameworks for your specific course. But you're going to be able, with this tool, to target instruction so that no time is wasted and so that your students remain engaged in their learning because they can see that it's what they miss and what they haven't mastered yet. All right, so by the time that you get to scenario number 3, you're feeling pretty confident about teaching your virtual class, right? You've already identified the content you need to teach. You've aligned it so that you can address each skill from lowest to highest level of difficulty. You have mapped out the entire trimester to make sure that you address all tested, non-mastered content that is represented by the specific group of students in your class. So now you kind of need to figure out what you can use to assess mastery of newly taught content. What does this look like in a virtual setting? And I get this question all the time. I'm going to tell you, stop stressing. You already know what needs to be taught. All you need to do now is assess learning after you deliver your lesson. Now, don't overthink it. There are many ways to do this, and there are many resources that you can use. You don't even need to create formal tests in order to gauge mastery of content. Let's look at some examples of ways to assess student learning. You can, for example, use publisher tests or quizzes, free online quizzes that target individual tape skills. You can use polls, forum posts, and even game type of assessments. The key here is that you must be sure to assess each identified tested tape skill. This is critical so that you can continue with the rest of scenario number 3. As we finish up with this third scenario, you have to remember that every time a student demonstrates mastery after instruction, you've got to update the student's IISP with the mastery date next to the corresponding TABE skill. Also, when your class as a whole demonstrates mastery of a particular TABE skill, you need to cross it out on your scope and sequence. This way, you can always go back and provide additional instruction on any remaining non-mastered content. Now remember, live data is the only really useful data. If your data is old and you do not maintain it current, guess what? It is absolutely useless. To make sure that your students will continue to make learning gains, you've got to continue to update their IISPs as well as your instructional scope and sequence. Now, let's get to scenario number 4. All right, now you've been teaching virtually for a couple of weeks now, and both you and your students are beginning to feel pretty good about this whole virtual instructional thing. You notice that a couple of your students, however, are a little frustrated, and you're not really sure how they're progressing since tape testing hasn't yet resumed. You know that you need to give them feedback on their progress. Yes, you grade their assignments and you provide oral feedback, but you're sensing that they are still lost. You decide that you're going to set aside some time every week to provide each student with individual updates regarding their progress. But what exactly should you go over? Does this sound familiar? Well, you usually use tape testing data, right, for your data chats. But now you need to make some adjustments given this virtual environment. First, let's figure out what you should discuss during each individual data chat. And let me give you some suggestions. The IISP should be at the very top of the list. Why? Well, if you have been documenting mastery consistently, then this tool is the most accurate progress data you have on each individual student. You should show the student how much or how little they have mastered within a selected time period. So for example, if you average one data chat meeting per student per week, then you should be able to address how many tape skills were mastered during that week. Next, discuss strengths and weaknesses. Ask the student, okay, which assignments were easy and which were not? Ask them to explain why certain assignments were difficult for them to complete. And finally, you may want to provide additional resources or even set up virtual tutoring options to address any learning difficulties or any deficiencies. And we're going to talk about how to use breakout rooms for this in a few slides. All right, now you know what you're going to say during these data chats, so you've got to figure out when you're going to hold them and how often. All right, we are all well aware that the virtual environment is much more demanding on teachers than the traditional brick and mortar classroom. During virtual instruction, teachers are constantly hands-on, providing instruction, guiding activities, correcting student responses, and doing a million other things, right? So basically, this leaves no time available for conducting individual, of all things, individual student data chats, right? Wrong. Think of the virtual classroom as you would your own physical classroom. When you're in your physical classroom, you give your students an assignment to complete while you pull individual students to hold data chats. Well, you can really do the same exact thing in your virtual classroom. For example, you may assign students to breakout rooms to complete an activity, create an extra breakout room, and then use this room to conduct your data chats with individual students. You probably schedule a breakout room activity daily, right? So I do. So every day you can rotate students so that you're able to meet with all of them within a given week, for example. Then you repeat the process every week so that you meet with students regularly to discuss their progress as documented on their IISPs. You can also hold data chats while students are completing a quiz or doing an independent assignment or maybe even a poll, right? Just get into the habit of holding data chats as often as possible. All right, so you now know what to discuss during a data chat, when to hold them, and how often. But you're still wondering, I am, what does it look like? Well, logistically speaking, it is all about breakout rooms. Let's look at the visual on the following slide. This visual shows you the easiest way to set up the stage for conducting virtual data chats. And this is through breakout rooms. Yes, with breakout rooms, okay, and it's so important, we're going to address this first, right? You start off with all the students in your virtual classroom, right? And then you provide an assignment and you split the students into different breakout rooms. Now, you decide how many rooms you want based on the number of students in your virtual classroom. Be sure to provide an assignment that takes at least 10 to 15 minutes so that you have sufficient time to complete 1 to 2 virtual data chats during this time or simultaneously. Now, once students are in the working breakout rooms, you invite one student at a time in order to review their IISP, their strengths, their weaknesses, etc. When the chat is over, return that student to the breakout room activity and then invite a new one to the data chat room, right? Rotate students until you've met with all of them. Now, keep in mind that the reason we recommend holding daily data chats, okay, is that you will not be able to meet with all of your students in one day. It is impossible. So set aside a time to do this every day, and then carefully schedule students so that you're able to regularly meet with all of them. It's important for you to be able to meet with students every week, especially in this virtual setting with no standardized testing in place, right? Now, once you establish a routine, the process is going to get easier and easier. Be sure to explain this process clearly to students, though, because they need to be aware of its significance, and they always be sure to follow up with feedback on the individual breakout room activities. Don't just leave them and say, okay, guys, do this activity. I'm going to do data chats, and then forget about, bringing them back and following up on the activity. Let's look at some other options for setting up data chats during this virtual class time. Now, this visual shows a slightly different option. Here, you can provide your virtual class with any type of activity or assignment, such as a quiz, a written assignment, or maybe even a discussion post where they can go back and forth, right? The students are going to remain in the main virtual classroom while you move to a breakout room. Now, notice that in this diagram, you only have one breakout room where you will be holding the data chats. All of the other students are working independently on their assignments. While your class is working hard, then you invite one student at a time to your breakout room in order to conduct his or her individual data chat. Now, let's take a closer look at the last scenario, scenario 5. By now, let's say you have provided the best placement for each of your students along with the appropriate IISP. You've used the IISPs to create a scope and sequence of instruction that specifically targets tested content by subject area and test level. You've recorded mastery on each student's IISP in order to log their progress and easily identify mastered and non-mastered content. And you've even held student data chats regularly in order to review progress, identify the learning gaps, and provide instructional interventions, right, as necessary. You're doing great, you know it. Your students are learning at an increasing rate. In fact, most of them have already mastered more than 80% of the tested content that is identified on their IISPs. But as great as this sounds, it seems to be becoming a problem. All right, post-testing hasn't yet resumed, so students are not moving to the next functional level. You know that they should be. You know they're ready because you have the proof in their updated IISPs. Is there anything else that you can use in order to justify moving them to the next functional level? Yes, there is. You guessed it. It is their IISPs. Let's take a closer look. As we think about this scenario number 5, I want you to breathe deeply and relax. You already have the solution to the problem. We just said the solution was the IISPs. Just think of when you were teaching back in your physical classrooms and you were already using the IISPs to determine when a student was ready to post-test. Remember that? Now, you would review each student's IISP, and if this student had accumulated a minimum number of instructional hours for post-testing, and they had demonstrated mastery of at least 75 to 80% of all identified tested content on his IISP, then you scheduled the student for post-testing. Remember that? Well, in the absence of post-testing, you can simply use the same IISP to substantiate whether or not the student is ready for the next functional level. If the student has mastered 75 to 80% of all tested content, you can use this information to recommend that the student be moved to a higher functional level. Now, please discuss this possibility with your administration. If it's approved, then be sure to share this information with your students so that they know how readiness for the next functional level is going to be assessed until official post-testing is reinstated. This will reduce everyone's level of frustration, I promise you, and it will at least provide a clear goal: 75 to 80% mastery on the IISP. Now, we are at the end of our training, but let's briefly summarize some key points because we did cover a lot of information in just a couple of slides. Let's summarize the 5 ways you can use the IISPs in your virtual classroom. First, you can initially use the IISPs to better identify new students' initial functional levels and provide the best placement for them, right? Next, you can use the IISPs to develop the scope and sequence, right? One that will emphasize all tested content based on the different level IISPs that are represented by the students in your virtual class. Target content for instruction by focusing on non-mastered TABE skills. 3, be sure that every time a student masters a TABE skill, you input the mastery date on the student's IISP. This will keep your data live so that you have a running log of non-mastered content that you still need to cover during instruction, that you need to emphasize. 4, be sure to hold virtual data chats using the IISPs as the central data piece. This will ensure that students are engaged in their learning and that they progress and that they do not become frustrated or unmotivated because they don't have a clear learning plan with established goals. This takes care of all that. Finally, at number 5, use the IISPs to determine when a student is better served by moving him or her to the next functional level. You know, it's probably safe to say that if the student has mastered 75 to 80% of all tested content, which is outlined on his IISP, then that student is ready for the next functional level. Once standardized testing resumes, then, you can just make any minor adjustments. Now, as always, I do like to end my trainings by emphasizing a growth mindset. I get this from June. So I ask you to just take what you have learned in this training one step further. First, change how you look at a virtual instruction. Look beyond the constraints of the physical classroom. Be sure to individualize instruction using the IISPs in order to address the instructional needs of each student. Don't get stuck in doing the same thing you were doing in the physical classroom. Take it to the virtual one. Next, redesign your online curriculum. Use your district calendar and the identified tested content on the IISPs and develop a scope and sequence that can serve as an instructional guide for your specific multi-level ABE classroom. Develop lessons and select instructional resources based on identified tested content. Make an active decision to drive all virtual instruction based on the information gathered from the IISPs and use it to motivate your students to become actively engaged in their own learning. Pace your activities based on each student's individual progress. Next, review all of the information covered in this webinar and look through the companion resource handbook. Share this information with teachers, administrators, district personnel, and you become the expert in this area. Have roundtable discussions with your administrative team and share the placement, instructional, and promotional options that were provided in this training. Reflect and make a change. Finally, ask yourself, what is working especially well in my virtual classroom and what is not working at all? Hold virtual data chats with your students regularly and be sure to update the IISPs every time content is mastered. Share your students' success with other teachers so that they too are motivated to implement changes that will keep students engaged in their online learning. And this concludes our webinar using the IISPs in a virtual setting. I think at this time we have a few minutes to answer some questions. So June, if you have any questions that have been asked throughout the webinar, you want to read those to me?
Maria, we really don't have any questions. We just have a lot of comments about what a great webinar this is and lots of resources they can use and lots of knowledge that they're going to be able to absorb and use later. So no particular questions. Oh, wait, there is one that just came in, a new one. Do you have any resource recommendations on practice tests, quizzes, or anything like that?
Well, whatever program you're using, whatever publisher you're using, they usually have pre-made tests that target specific tape skills. So you can use those. That would be my primary choice. If you have a computer-based instruction and part of a blended learning program at your site, maybe you have computer software such as Essential Ed's Tape Academy. They also have pre-made pre-test and actual post-test for each of the tape skills that are included in their instructional portfolio. And you can use that as well. But you know what, folks? You can literally just type it in the search button in Google and so much of it, information will come up regarding pre-made tests. There are a ton of pre-made little small tests that are maybe like 2 or 3 questions addressing each individual tape skill. Just make sure that you address each one separately so that you can then mark it on the IISPs. But there is no set thing where you have to use one thing or the other. It really doesn't matter.
Right. And Maria, I was thinking about the matrices because in the matrices, you can click on those resource activities that are small, little bite-sized, pieces of information that is associated with each one of those curriculum frameworks. And it does have a little quiz in there at the end of it. So that's another thing that people could begin to look at too. There's lots of resources. If you get stuck, you just contact us and we'll help to guide you.
Absolutely.
Okay, Maria, well, we're going to go on now to get the feedback from everyone, because your feedback really matters to us so much. And we want to hear from you so that we can continue to improve our IPDAY training. So think about what would you like IPDAY to provide future webinars on this topic? Would you recommend this webinar to others? Do you plan to apply what you've learned from this webinar? And while you're doing this, I just want to, all of us here at IPDAY want to wish you a great Thanksgiving break. We're going to take a little break on the webinars, and we are going to resume on December 2nd. I really don't want you to miss out on this webinar. This webinar is titled An Introduction to Entrepreneurship Innovation, and you're hearing a lot about this in adult education. It's an entrepreneurial skills integration guide for adult education teachers. Again, that's December 2nd. You can already go on the IPDAY website and register for it. You will not want to miss this. So with that being said, I thank all of you for joining us today, and I thank Maria Gutierrez for her great webinar today. Here you have some information here on all the IISPs contain information obtained from source documents. So everything we do is research-based, and you can know that it is obtained from source documents. That is in your PowerPoint and your guidebook. So again, this concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on December 2nd.
Thank you, folks. Have a great day.